welcome to the Authentic BA podcast. My name is Bumi Falari. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some helpful tips for when you're preparing for UAT. As a business analyst, one of the things that you'd be required to do is to run UAT. If you don't know what UAT is, UAT stands for User Acceptance Testing. Essentially what that means is a period of time where the users actually test the solution that has been developed and ensures that they can approve it to move to production. So one of the things I always say to people, or one of the things I always do when I'm preparing for UAT is I need to first of all understand what the scope of UAT is. Remember, UAT is just a type of testing. You're not going to be able to perform or test every type of thing during UAT. So you've got to plan or think about the scope. What's my UAT scope going to cover? What features or what modules of the solution am I going to test during the UAT? Usually you would decide this with the business stakeholders, for example, or the end users, and they would help you to determine or define what the UAT scope should be. Once you have done that, what you should then start to think about is, right, who's going to participate in UAT? You've got to plan this ahead. You can't just assume that users will test. You need to know who's going to be testing what. Sometimes, for example, if you're testing a system where things happen over consecutive days or over a period of time, you're going to need maybe a selection of users, for example, or you're testing a change that crosses certain modules of the system where users have different roles and responsibilities. So you're going to need a variety of users to be involved in the testing. So your scope will determine who needs to participate in the UAT. Make sure you inform them, make sure you keep them abreast of the progress of the planning and when UAT is going to happen. Once you have done that, start to think about, how do I plan UAT? What's going to be my plan for UAT? For example, how many days do we need to run UAT? Bearing in mind that some of these people who are going to be testing or participating in UAT probably have day jobs as well that they have to keep on top of. So the UAT is typically an add-on to their day-to-day. So make sure that you leave enough time to cover off all the things that you have identified as scope for UAT testing. Once you have planned the UAT, planning involves looking at the scope, the timeline, what test scenarios, for example, we're going to execute. What are the acceptance criteria for each test scenario? Remember, if you've watched our video on writing requirements, one of the key things we have to do is to define an acceptance criteria. This is where this becomes really important. So how do we, once we've tested the scenario, how do we know that that scenario has passed? So define all of those things. Make sure that you capture and think about your test environments as well. You know, what test environments are you going to use? Creating user test access for users to access the test environment as well and have the right roles to do the things that they need to execute in the testing environment. So lots of things that you need to think about. I'm going to do a bit more detailed video on planning UAT and creating a UAT plan. Next thing you need to do is then focus more on creating the actual test cases. So develop a detailed test case. Users really don't have time to think about the critical details of your solution. Typically, if you leave them to it, they just want to test what they do on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps that doesn't cover everything that you need to cover from a new feature or a new module perspective. So make sure you create test cases to help guide them in terms of what they need to test. Once you've created your test cases, then you need to prepare some test data. Remember, you're working in a test environment, so you need to create data that is relevant for what you're about to test. So test data that supports the scenarios that you've created test cases for. So then you need to prepare that test data and make sure that it works in the test environment. Next thing to do is then setting up the test environment. Remember I talked about deciding which users or who needs to participate in UAT. Now you have to make sure that they're set up correctly. Make sure that they can log into the environment and do the things that they need to do. They can perform the roles that they need to perform. They can access the modules that they need to access to ensure that UAT goes smoothly. Once you have set up the test environment, all of the configuration is there, any test conditions has been set up, then you can move on to maybe running a demo session, for example. This is not compulsory, but typically, especially if you're onboarding a new piece of functionality or a feature, you're going to want to to train your UAT testers so they understand what has changed or what's new in the solution or even the complete solution itself, so that they're able to execute UAT properly. Once you've trained them or done the demo of the solution to them, get some feedback from them. Make sure that they understand what they need to do. Also make sure they understand when they start testing how they're going to log any defects that they might find, for example, how they are going to communicate with you, and that they really understand what their responsibilities are. So in terms of responsibilities as well, you want to make sure that you know who is going to sign off. Sometimes the sign-off authority on the UAT is not actually the person that performs the UAT. Perhaps it's their manager, and so they need to give UAT feedback to the manager, who then signs off. So make sure that those roles and responsibilities are clearly understood before the UAT starts, and communicate the expectations clearly to everyone involved and all of your stakeholders. So things like when UAT is going to start, how long UAT is expected to go on for, particularly if you're going to leave users to do UAT in their own time, for example. So there isn't a specific focused period of the day where UAT happens. Make sure you communicate clearly how long they've got to do UAT, what needs to happen at the end of every day. For example, how do you check in to make sure UAT is progressing as you expect, who's going to sign off, and when they're going to need to sign off. So when is UAT expected to end? By what time do we need to have executed all of these scenarios? If your test scenarios follow a timeline, so certain things have to happen in order for you to get to the final test cases or to be able to execute the final test cases, for example, make sure that that timeline is clear to your participants and everyone knows what they're doing and when they're doing it. Then we come to executing the UAT. When you execute the UAT, or when your testers execute the UAT, make sure that they follow the UAT plan. Make sure that they follow the test scripts and that they record their test results as well, because that's proof that the test has been successful or the test has not been successful, and we can take that information in order to fix any defects that get raised from UAT. Once UAT is in execution and you're gathering feedback, you're finding that there are issues in UAT that need to be resolved, you need to then liaise with the development team to ensure those items are resolved and that the fixes are made available in good time for those scenarios to be retested in order for UAT to continue. You might need to have several cycles of UAT, for example, depending on how big UAT is. Again, this is something that I will talk about in more detail when I do a session on UAT planning. So you might need to think about doing 2 or 3 cycles of UAT, which means you run the test cases or the test scenarios in one cycle, you find defects, fix the defects, and then repeat the cycle again until we get a clean run, basically, or until we get a successful run. And a successful run doesn't necessarily mean that there are no defects. It just means that there are no significant defects that stop us from progressing. So as you're capturing defects, you might want to run it by the stakeholder. So some defects might be classed as a minor defect, for example, and something that maybe we put on the backlog to fix at a later time if it's not significant or it doesn't detract much from the objectives or the deliverables of the project. Finally, once UAT is done and you've completed all the cycles and we've come to a place where we have an acceptable solution to the business, they've tested as much as they can or want to, and all the scope of UAT is complete, and we're satisfied that the solution is of enough quality, then we're ready to request sign off. And then we do this to the people we identified initially. You request the sign off, and that could be the person who conducted the testing, as I said earlier, or this might mean referring to their manager, and so they give feedback to the manager, who then decides whether or not to sign off UAT. I hope you've found this useful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. I'm going to try and answer them. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Make sure you smash the subscribe button, and I hope to see you in the next video.